Let's take a look at the t-shirts problem, which was the final problem on Quiz 2. And in this problem, you're told that this firm has generated some cash flow, which was used to pay off debt. And the hint there is that that cash flow occurred in the past. It's already been used for something, so we certainly don't want to take credit for that $100,000 in the free value of or the fair value of our firm. So we need to keep that in mind as we build this out. The other big hint in the problem is that the cash flow is growing at 1% per year forever. So that suggests a perpetuity and the use of the Gordon formula, which you'd used in the previous problem. It's on this formula sheet in this file. It's on page 20 and I believe perhaps 82 in the book. So we're probably going to make use of that formula to account for that cash flow growing forever at some point. Now, the most straightforward way that you could approach this would be to use exactly the template from the previous problem, which is kind of our discounted cash flow template we've been using in this class, where we look at the most recent cash flow, not part of our valuation, but a good reference point from which we can grow our cash flow at the 1%. And most people like to grow it about 5 years, like the template showed, but some did fewer, some did more. And then I'll show you how you really didn't need to do any, which most people did. And after you get finished growing that cash flow, you want to calculate a terminal value that represents all of the cash flows forever beyond that current year and puts it in terms of dollars in that last year, that terminal year we call it, or year 5 in this case. And then once we know the value of those two things, we can sum them. We can take the net present value of all these items, and that's the fair value of the firm. We don't have any debt or cash to adjust to get to equity. And so that is the fair value of the firm. And so this is using the template from the previous page. There's really nothing special about growing this for 5 years. In the next problem I show we could just grow it for 1 year. This is exactly the same math, exactly the same template, but we just have this current year that we're told about, and then we have next year with a cash flow and a terminal value. We can add those together. We can divide by 1 plus the discount rate, or we could take the NPV. Which, by the way, either way we do it, whether it's 5 years or 1 or a different number, we know those cash flows are at the end of the period, so we don't want any multiplier out here like 1 plus the whack to the 0.5 power square root 1 plus the whack. We don't want to pull the first cash flow out of the NPV because we do want it to get a full period of discounting, and so it's just a very straightforward use of the NPV for this end of year cash flows. So if you look at this a bit closer, you realize, well, there was really no need to grow this for a year, calculate a terminal value, and then discount it. We could have just done the very straightforward task of saying, what does the Gordon formula tell us about the fair price of the firm given the current cash flow? And so the Gordon formula will take that current cash flow of 100,000, increment it by 1%, and then divide by the WACC minus the growth rate, and give us the same answer that we got with the previous two approaches. No matter how we get that answer, we want to compare that to what the market is saying on a multiples basis about firms like this. And we're told that the market is telling us that about 10 times next year's cash flow is the fair value of the firm. So we want to take 10 times, 10 times this year's cash flow times 1 plus the growth rate to get next year's cash flow, and that gives us the fair value of the firm. So how much are we overpaying relative to that reference point? We subtract the two, and a lot of people got those backwards. Make sure you don't get those backwards. And then if we want to see that as a percent, we can write it like this. A lot of people wrote it like this, where they said the purchase price minus the reference point, let's call it, divided by the reference point. They get the same answer, format the same. But there's a high probability a lot of people, instead of putting B18 in the denominator, put B17 in the denominator. So instead of having to grab 3 cells from my formula that way, I can grab 2 this way. We're going to do this about 1,000,000 times when we get to portfolio optimization. So if you want to get more used to that formula, it may save you some time later in the course. I want to make a couple of comments about 2 other approaches that we saw when grading these quizzes. This one I liked a lot. Someone decided to forecast for 10 years. Must have been something in the problem that caused a lot of people to want to go for 10 years before they calculated their terminal value. This is really the same model as this, just turned on its side and done vertically instead of horizontally. The problem with this and why this person got 80% credit was they put that terminal value in the 11th year. And so when they looked at an NPV, it was discounting the terminal value by 1 extra year. That would be the equivalent of coming back over here and putting this cell over here in the next column. So we don't want to do that. And that's why we have a separate row for the free cash flows and for the terminal value. So if we look at that in this vertical model over here, I rebuilt their model, took this and said, let's treat it more like this, where we take the same terminal value, the same number they calculated, but put it in that 10th year, because that's what the Gordon formula gives us, is the value in the 10th year of all future cash flows. And then from there we can just take the NPV of the sum. Didn't even need that extra cell, but take the NPV of the sum of the free cash flows and the terminal value and put it over here. Get the same answer either way. Speaking of partial credit, I wanted to point out over here, so 40% of this problem was weighted toward getting the fair purchase price. That's where all the work was. 10 times next year's cash flow was pretty easy. Subtracting 2 cells was pretty easy, and taking their percentage difference was pretty easy. So the weighting on the grading was 40, 20, 20, 20. I think that's correct. Yeah. So here's a person who didn't get the fair purchase price right. Gave them half credit because for some reason they took the Gordon formula and then took it to the power of 0.5, or I guess actually took the denominator to the power of 0.5, which really didn't make any sense at all. So they lost some points for that, but they did everything else correct. And I just want to point out that even if you didn't get the first, even if you'd left that point blank and you'd come in here and done that simple math and that simple subtraction and that simple subtraction, then you still would have gotten 60% of the points on the problem, even if you'd have left that blank. So this is one of the points I want to drive home about models, is if we can build out part of our model and get it working correctly, and then come back later after we get some help and build in the rest, then this part already works perfectly. So we certainly want to give partial credit when that's the case. Thanks for watching.